we are going to have a panel today, and it is entitled, Are We Truly Innovative? So we're going to talk about what the definition of innovative means, but you can think about that in the context of the Jetsons or Minority Report, or you can think about that in the context of other things. Let me just really quickly introduce the panel so everyone knows who's here, and then we can get into the discussion. Tyler Cowen, to my right, your left, as a professor of economics at George Mason University, author of The Great Stagnation. Andrew McAfee is the principal research scientist at MIT, author of Race Against the Machine, and a new book out, right? How new is that book, Vijay?
Just released in March.
Okay, so, and Vijay Vaitheeswaran is the author of Need, Speed, and Greed, and he is also a writer and correspondent, lives in China for The Economist. Sure. So thank you all for being here. I want to start with Tyler, because it might be an interesting way to frame up this discussion. When I said that sometimes people think about innovation in the context of the Jetsons, right? I'm here holding my iPad, and that's pretty cool, and that seems like we've innovated, and yet we've had over half a dozen panels here about the race to cure cancer. So we have not necessarily innovated in all sectors. The flight here from New York still took 5 hours, it raises a question for me, and this is what you wrote. So these are your own words, Tyler. You wrote, "My grandmother, who was born in 1905, spoke often about the immense changes she had seen, including the widespread adoption of electricity, the automobile, flush toilets, antibiotics, and convenient household appliances. Since my birth, 1962, I apologize for dating you, it seems to me there have not been comparable improvements. Compared with what my grandmother witnessed, the basic accoutrements of life have remained broadly the same." Expound upon that.
Absolutely true. If you go back to...
You wrote it.
Yes, exactly. Still true. If you go back to 1900, most Americans lived on farms, and 6% of people graduated from high school. By 1950, we had a fundamentally different world, and it was also different in communications, radio, television. Really, everything changed within 50 years. If you put me back in a TV show, say from the 1960s, I know how everything works. Things are better today, the sofas are more comfortable, the automobiles have better tires. We've had one dynamic sector, which you could call communications, computers/internet, and that's great, but it tends to be a sector whose importance is overrated by the elites, people who spend their time on their iPhone or iPad and who do something maybe connected to journalism or intellectual life. For most Americans, if you look at median income for the typical household, it is barely up since 1973. I take that as the most direct marker. We have simply not had that many life-altering technological innovations since 1973. If you look at male wages, since 1969, the median male wage is down, and a lot of our gains have come from women working longer hours.
Andrew, I assume you take great offense at this. Right before this panel, I should tell you, he told me that I was going to be out of a job within the decade because computers were going to take over my role as a journalist.
I think Tyler's imagery of his grandmother is extraordinarily helpful. And one of the other images I've heard him lay out is looking around his kitchen and thinking about how little innovation there has been in the American kitchen for the last half century. So I want to try to combine those two and think about Tyler touring his grandma around his kitchen today. And she'd be kind of nodding and knowing how things work, and she might think the microwave is fairly cool. But that would support his idea of a broad stagnation in serious innovation until the telephone rang, and then Tyler would pull out something that looks like this, and Grandma might say, "Where's the wire, where's the handset?" And he'd have to explain what wireless communication is. And then he might answer the phone and have a video conversation with somebody halfway around the world for free, and Grandma would probably be impressed by that. Tyler then might be able to look up a recipe to help Grandma do some cooking in the kitchen on this, paying no money for it. He might be able to look up the answer to almost any question his grandmother would ask him. If his grandma happened to have a blemish on her skin of some kind, Tyler could take a picture of it with a phone, upload it to this thing called the cloud, get an instant free diagnosis of it to tell Grandma if she needed to go get that thing checked out or not. That would be free and of higher quality than what she would get from the average dermatologist visit. And at this point, if Grandma weren't having her mind blown, she's a tough lady to impress. before too long, Grandma's going to be able to leave the kitchen to go for a grocery run and hop in a car that drives itself. I had the chance to take a ride in Google's autonomous car a little while back. The fact that I'm still sitting here means that it works as advertised. It handled the stop-and-go traffic on US 101 with no problem at all, and nobody driving the darn thing. And I think in some ways we have actually outstripped the Jetsons, because if, as I remember that show, George did drive his own spaceship back and forth to work. We're not going to be doing that for very much longer. So I appreciate what Tyler's saying, and one way to think about the distinction might be in many ways in the world of atoms. I think the rate of progress in some things has slowed down. In the world of bits, in the world of information, I think we are living in an era of absolutely astonishing progress where science fiction is being turned into reality on a daily basis. My biggest point of disagreement is about the importance of innovation in that bit world. Tyler says it's confined to a fairly narrow communications and media sector. I think that's dead flat wrong. The spillovers from that sector to the rest of the economy are already big, huge, and only going to get bigger.
Okay, Vijay, take it on, but also if
Wait,
you
but
could, go ahead.
I feel remiss not bringing up my own grandmother here, okay? Because this, this seems to be the order of the day. And in doing this, I want to make 2 points. One, actually, to challenge Tyler, but the second, in some ways, to support you. So, if you don't mind, Tyler, I will use your name in vain a couple of ways. My grandmother was in India. I was born in India, grew up partly there, and the grandmothers I mostly see now are in China because that's where I live. And unlike the picture of stagnation, where you focus on particularly the United States, and we can come back to that in a moment, if you look at the experience of grandmothers living today as well as their grandchildren in the developing world, this has been an extraordinary period to be alive. One of the greatest in human history. A billion people, perhaps, lifted out of poverty in the shortest imaginable time, a generation or so. Yep. The rise of the East Asian tigers, and the role that invention, connecting to value creation, and really, we mustn't conflate technology per se or gadgets or gizmos with innovation. It's when new ideas, technology or not, create value. That's really what innovation is. They have done so for many, many people in extraordinarily amazing ways around the world. And part of it is the mobile revolution. You can send money using M-Pesa in Kenya. If you're a absolutely impoverished person, something I can't do with my money center bank based out of New York even today. So some extraordinary leapfrogging innovations are coming up, transforming the world. And it's not just the elites. I thought you were a bit unfair, because actually the greatest growth and some of the largest numbers of mobile phone and internet users are going to be in the developing world. That's also where you see novel business models, new ways of creating micro-franchise, connecting capital with money. This is happening, so that I think it undersells the picture of stagnation when we look at it from the bottom up rather than the top down.
Okay, but I'll still look at the bottom up. So what about medicine?
Yes.
You could argue we've innovated in some respects, but not wholly, not in ways that people thought 10, 20, 30 years ago. I think there's some things we have not hit. Energy, we're working on it. 3% of our energy is really from wind and solar. That's it. And really, I think I would argue closer to 3% is wind. We're not on Mars. And as I said, the plane.
Are you with Newt Gingrich in wanting to get there quickly? Is that the point?
I'm just curious.
Yeah. Look, I mean, energy and health, these are two beats that I covered for The Economist in my time, 20 years at the paper for my sins. And these are among the least innovative big businesses on earth. I would agree with that broad point. But equally, and in part because of how they're regulated, they're very asset intensive. Also, they deliver services that many people find acceptable. The problems are, how do you get these very slow-moving industries that are typically very slow to learn? Unlike the software industry, which has low barriers to entry, two guys in a garage can create a micro-multinational, you learn quickly from mistakes. The culture of these two industries you happen to mention is exactly the opposite, right? But even there, I think you can find there are signs of change. And part of it is through the fact that the world is now much flatter. And yet it's not flat in the way it has been portrayed on this stage before. It's lumpy. And you're seeing disruptive innovations, new business models, frugal engineering in medical devices, just to give a concrete example. Companies from China are coming up with medical devices rather than the next $100,000 scanner, which we're all familiar with from the big Western companies, where last year was the open MRI, next year it's the swim-through MRI. And you're like, look, this is the only industry in the world where innovation means a lot more expensive and just a little bit better. right? In anything else, cars, PCs, mobile phones, it's usually cheaper, faster, better. And so this industry has gotten itself into this. Well, guess what? It's not the only game in town. If you're GE or Philips or Siemens, you're seeing companies like Mindray, which is a Chinese company listed on the New York Stock Exchange, come up with things that are smaller but also better, not just smaller and cheaper. And so I think you should watch the periphery to see where the disruptions are coming.
Andrew, take the other side of it.
No, I'm going to take the.
Agree. Take it.
I will argue with this. Healthcare is so much fun to beat up on for so many reasons, and we all feel like it's a massive, incredibly stagnant industry. It's not. The public health gains in recent decades in America have been astonishing. The time of stagnation in public health was during the 1960s and 1970s, which was an era of great productivity growth. So by some of the measures that we economists are extremely fond of, those were the halcyon days. Life expectancy was standard for 2 decades at about 70 years, and since then it has inched up very steadily to about 80 years. Mortality from all kinds of disease has gone through the floor in recent decades. Your chances of dying in a hospital have gone way down. So we can all think of our favorite things to dislike about the healthcare system and its massive inertia. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact there has been substantial positive innovation in recent decades there.
Tyler, you agree?
Just a few points. First, Indian grandma. There's been plenty of catch-up growth in India and China, we all agree. The question is the nations on the frontier. How have they done? Healthcare. The big improvements come in the early part of the 20th century. Things like clean water, antibiotics, vaccines. We've had nothing comparable lately. Healthcare is a mixed sector. If you consult David Cutler, arguably the world's leading expert on the topic, he measures recent healthcare productivity at negative over the last few years. So there's some advances, there's some setbacks, genomics haven't paid off. It's a complicated picture, but it's nothing like antibiotics. There's the information technology sector, we all agree, and then the other example you hear is driverless cars, which is something we're not even allowed to use. And I've spoken to plenty of people involved in driverless cars, and they will all admit to me, kind of in a hushed voice, it will have to happen in some other country first, partly for liability reasons.
Okay, so Tyler, what is the answer then? If we are not as innovative as we think we are, and we want to be more innovative in these other sectors, what are we doing wrong?
I think there's 2 key answers. The first is good news. I'm actually an optimist about the future. So I think the last 40 years have been fairly dismal for innovation, but the internet will pay off in ways which it hasn't yet. For instance, in education, another very stagnant sector, but it will be revolutionized. So a lot of the good developments, they're on their way. There's a lot of talk of the future tense in these 2 presentations. That's great, I largely agree, but it's the future tense. We've been coming out of a dismal time. So I would say education, more support for basic science, and just more belief in ourselves culturally that we can do or be something.
Actually, I think you make a profound point there, Tyler, that is in talking about the future and the future tense. Your grandma had those wonderful things that she was able to experience because of massive investments that were made many decades prior. Even some going back to, for example, the great Victorian era of invention, 130 years ago, where the basic foundations of modern chemistry, grid electrification, and we can count a number of things that were ultimately to be the bedrock of 20th century economic prosperity that later became value-creating innovation. But at the time, they were either tinkering or marginal or hadn't found a business case yet, or investors, and we might very well be undergoing several decades of that. And what you might have described, as what you did describe as a bad few decades behind us, actually have seen massive investments, for example, in material science, in the forms of biology that have now led to synthetic genomics. And you can go through one sector after another where investments, foundational investments, biotech, have been made, and you don't know which bets will pay off. That's the nature of innovation. But it's wrong to say it was merely a period of stagnation. It was also a period where massive investments were made.
The invention of the PC, the invention of the internet, the sequencing of the human genome, the growth of mobile phones from nothing to, what is it, 5 or 6 billion now? I can't call that a dismal time. I think you and I probably agree a great deal about what's going to happen in the future, and I think we're both fairly optimistic. Right. I continue to struggle with your characterization of the time that we've been living through as some dark time in the era of substantial innovation.
If you look at actual studies, consumer surplus from having an internet connection, it's 2 to 4% of income, which is great, that's a lot. But when you realize median incomes have barely budged since 1973, and you're going to tack on top of that 2 to 4% and say, this is great, I don't get it. My grandma would be impressed by my smartphone, she'd think it was a great walkie-talkie. She was the one who taught me to call up Hackensack Library to ask a question. Now I could Google it. But when you look at actual data on how much people value this stuff, only in this last year have half of all Americans even had smartphones, and they've been on the market. It's simply not enough to overturn the other numbers we have about pretty stagnant growth in living standards.
The median income is both an incredibly important statistic and a red herring in this case. The median income is the 50th percentile. Right. There are as many people above you as below you. And Tyler's exactly right. Whether you look at wealth or income, it's been stagnant for, 15 years at least? It's totally flat for about 15 years.
Well, we're talking about that's here.
Let me go down, let me say a couple more words. Heading down in a couple of recent years. So that's pretty dire. The mean income, or the GDP per capita, if you take the total amount of value created in the US, divide it by the number of people, that's been on a relatively steady upward trajectory, with the huge exception of the Great Recession. So looking at the median as a way to capture total value or total innovation, I think is the wrong way to go. The median is about the distribution of the value that's created. I completely agree that that's heading in a fairly unpleasant direction. But it's not the right stat to look at the total amount of wealth and innovation.
Okay, I want to go to China. That's where I want to go, Vijay. I want to talk about China. I want to talk about innovation in China. I want to know if our lunch is about to be eaten.
Well, I have some good news for those of us Americans in this room. That is, claims that China is already beating America on innovation are vastly overblown. That's not true. In fact, China is still largely a very poor country. And it is still largely working its way out of being a sweatshop to the world. That's really what has brought China the prosperity that is being amazingly integrated into the global supply chain, making stuff effectively, efficiently, and at scale, and increasingly having a domestic market for it as well. Here's the big news. We're at the end of cheap China. There's coastal regions where all this stuff is made and shipped to Walmart. Guess what? They've had double-digit wage increases for 10 years or more, and more importantly, regulatory burdens actually intentionally asked for by a middle class. They have enough people in the middle class that now don't want toxic sludge dumped on their children that they're clamoring for and getting regulations that cost more for business, right? And this is all part of actually an explicit government plan to move away from that sort of manufacturing. So China wants to be an innovation powerhouse. It's part of their 5-year strategy. They're spending hundreds of billions of dollars. But in my judgment, that's not where the innovation is going to come from in China. That top-down approach of spreading lots of jam amongst favored clusters. They've, for example, decided they're going to dominate the Internet of Things, the next big thing in the world of Internet, and by deciding where they're going to set up these centers of excellence and distribute a bunch of money, a lot of money, actually. And that's not actually how Silicon Valley sprung up. There's a lot more serendipity to how the magic happened. So when I mention that example of Mindray or some of these other Chinese companies, I tend to look at the private sector in China, which is big but often overshadowed by the state-owned enterprises, often crowded out for bank loans, which tend to go to the state enterprises. So there is an unbelievably vibrant private sector that's struggling against the odds in China. That's where the real action is.
Okay, so here's the public policy question for all three of you. If you could create the utopia of innovation, what are the levers that you'd be pulling on? You can go.
I think it's not about levers. I think but
if China's not doing it right? Your argument is China's not doing it right.
I think they're, broadly speaking, getting what they think that is the most important things to do are not going to be the most important things. If they can get the rule of law right, I think that would go a lot further, to be honest. And if they can get out of the business of funding state-funded oligopolies, which are exempt from competition law, they would do a lot more to encourage innovation than they're doing now. So the things that they are doing are mostly getting in the way, in my judgment.
The risk with China, I think, is simply that they're too far from the innovation frontier, and there's too much corruption in their science. I don't really believe in levers when it comes to innovation. If there were levers, there are things we might have done already. We are cutting funding for basic science, which is a big mistake, and I think a lot boils down to education. The high school completion rate in this country peaked in the late 1960s. That, to me, is almost a one-sentence proof of great stagnation. And you can talk about information technology all you want, but if you don't have the education to know how to use it and to benefit from it, either as a consumer or a worker, you have a very large segment of the population which is not getting these public goods. Right. Improving education takes a long time. It's not a silver bullet.
If we've been sitting here kind of On the order of 110 years ago, the equivalent to you, Tyler, would be saying, look, we can talk about this fantastic steam engine all you want, but it's not going to solve all of our problems. The Industrial Revolution, brought on by that technology that allowed us to overcome the limitations of our muscles, led to a bigger explosion in human well-being than anything else that's ever happened by a lot. It was such a big deal that, in the words of Ian Morris, who a historian just wrote a great book about the history of kind of human progress, said it made mockery out of everything that had come before. What we're doing right now is overcoming the limitations of our individual minds to at least the same extent. I cannot believe that that's not going to be as big a deal for the planet. So to talk about it as like we can overemphasize these gadgets, we cannot overemphasize these gadgets.
Andrew, talk about a little bit, I read your book, and you talk about some pretty scary stuff in terms of machines really taking over what we do and what the world looks like in a machine-led world. Yep. And how we should be preparing for that and what it means to everybody in this audience.
So my only source of kind of concern or big source of concern or pessimism going forward is the fact that I see technologies doing such amazing things they could never do before, things where up until now, if you wanted them done, you had to involve a person. Just not the case anymore. When I look ahead, I worry about what the average worker, the median worker, is going to have to offer to the labor force in an era of astonishing technologies. For example, there are about 3.5 million people who drive trucks for a living in the United States. And Tyler's concerns about regulatory barriers to driverless cars, extremely well-founded. Let's assume those away. Those 3.5 million people are not going to have nearly as much to offer. You're a journalist. The earnings announcements, the stories about corporate earnings announcements that appear in Forbes these days are written by a piece of software. There's no human being involved in them at all. They read perfectly cleanly. I talked to the guy that founded that company.
Really?
Absolutely correct. He tells me that if you give him the stats of a baseball game, he will write us narratives for what happened, where if you're a Yankees fan, it's about how you had the game in hand until the bullpen gave it away in the 9th inning. I'm a Red Sox fan. I will read about the scrappy, come-from-behind, never-say-die Red Sox. And I will read a different story every day with a different tone and a different narrative arc based on nothing more than the box score of the baseball game. So I start to see technologies doing some fairly weird things that they never ever did before, and I worry about the labor force implications of that. To me, that's not evidence of stagnation. That's evidence of exactly the opposite.
Vijay, you want to jump in? You're making a face.
Yes, no, I'm just nervous about what I'm going to do when my job is gone. No, I think, while I can see the advance that you're talking about, it seems to me that there have always been the fears that robots will take our jobs, right? And automation has been a part of the last, well, really, all of history, but certainly in the last few decades, and we will find something better to do. Right? And that is the task, that is the great task of society, is to find things. And often it is things that are drudge work. I mean, writing up earnings reports, frankly, is not the most glamorous end of journalism. Right. It's having a sexy job on Squawk Box and chairing fancy panels like Andrew does. I challenge you to find a robot that will replace his charm, for example.
No.
And
so being this close to him, I assure you that's not going to happen.
Right. So if you tell me the audience will be replaced by a robot, then I start worrying. That's when I worry.
In your book, you talk about greed. You talk about speed, need, and greed. You talk about the profit motive in capitalism. Is it not working as well as it should?
Well, I think that there's been a huge backlash against capitalism, understandably, in the age of Enron and Lehman Brothers. We see governments rightly strengthening regulation, crack down on various elements of bad behavior on Wall Street. But when I look at innovation, what I worry about is that the return of industrial policy, as it's been called, has been done under the guise of sort of solving the recession and dealing with the sort of the problems in capitalism. And I think we've gone too far. So when I talk about greed, I think we need greed. I'm here to defend capitalism in a sense, but not Gordon Gekko Wall Street capitalism in its unvarnished kind. I think rather than see greed as good kind of capitalism, I say let's harness greed for good. And if we were to able to harness the potential of entrepreneurs, innovators, working on socially important problems, and we can talk about what incentives mean. And of course, that's really what I'm talking about. How do we make sure to reward innovators more richly? And there's economists have long studied and argued that the lion's share of rewards from innovation tend to go not to the person that invents a device or even the society that came up with it, but the one that where it's adopted, diffused more generally, right? So there's spillovers, as it were. I think Larry Summers would have put it that way. And so if we want to solve some of the big problems, climate change, the growing threat of pandemics, I mean, we're living in an age of tremendous problems with lots of global commons issues, social issues. I want to harness that potential from the bottom up, from the private sector, be that the social sector or the for-profit sector, rather than say, let aid do it, let a big government do it. So I think we've gone too far. So I want to harness greed.
Okay, role of regulation in the world of innovation. I ask it in this context. I interviewed Anthony Coles this morning from Onyx Pharmaceuticals. He just spent $1 billion, took him 10 years to get a new cancer drug out into the market.
Yeah.
We could do this with other industries. Banking, very hard to start a new bank or do anything actually new or interesting in the banking world. Airlines, actually, very regulated world. What is the role and what is going on in your minds? And how are you, in particular, as someone who thinks we are in the great stagflation, do you blame regulators? Do you say we're doing too much regulation?
It's part of the problem, but in my view, there's far too much regulation. If we had to build today's energy infrastructure with today's regulations, we never could do it. And then we're supposed to build tomorrow's energy infrastructure, whether it's driverless cars, pharmaceuticals, education. So many of the stagnant sectors of the American economy have far too much regulation. I don't think getting rid of those regulations would cure the problem, but it's at least a first step toward being more dynamic. And it's no accident that at the time when growth is most rapid, late 19th, early 20th century, it is a far less regulated time.
Andrew, where are you on that?
The Kauffman Foundation out of Kansas City has done what I think is the best work on the state of American entrepreneurship, and they've documented kind of a steady downward trend in new business formation. And we tend to think about entrepreneurship as Instagram or Dropbox or this red-hot Silicon Valley stuff. That's a tiny sliver of the actual new business formation. Most of it is some guy starting up a car wash or something. There's been kind of a steady downward trend in the amount of that going on in the economy over, I think, a couple decades anyway. It appears that one of the reasons for that is that the regulatory thicket that an entrepreneur faces is kind of a big deal, and they confront that and go, maybe I'll just keep my day job. So I think I'm with Tyler. In many sectors, I would like to see governments getting out of the way and letting innovation flourish.
But maybe let me offer a different take on this. You had mentioned the medical field. Antibiotics is a great example. Tyler invoked it as an example of how we're in a stagnation, right? And it's true. Most of the antibiotics that are out there were harvested, sort of low-hanging fruit from the pharma business in the 1950s and 60s. And we're running out of really good antibiotics. And so among the last things I did as health correspondent before I went off to China was to write a major take on superbugs for The Economist, where I really delved deeply, talked to the heads of R&D at the big pharma companies, the biotech companies, public health researchers. And boy, if you're not scared now, once you read this piece, you will be, or other pieces like it. It is a really scary time, both from certainly viral superbugs emerging, new pandemic threats, but the bacterial variety as well. And the main reason, or main symptom of the problem is we're not coming up with new antibiotics. Very slow pace. If you look at the drugs pipeline, FDA applications, dramatic decline. Part of the reason is the science is tough. It's much harder than it used to be. We did the easy stuff. Genomics has been a complete flop in this area. It has been absolutely unhelpful. That's not to say it won't produce revolutions in other areas, but the part that gets to your question is incentives. And that is, there is no incentive from the regulatory structure or the reimbursement structure across the world for drug companies to come up with new antibiotics. Why? If you think about it, if you can come up with the next Viagra or the next Lipitor, you're going to get a massive payback, a blockbuster drug, $20 billion drug. People have to take their Lipitor every day, and it's an expensive pill. If you'd make a great antibiotic, the best in the world, people take it for 2 weeks and then stop taking it, right? And when you measure on mortality and morbidity reward, many systems, national health systems as well as parts of the US health system, reward other drugs, be that cancer drugs or other drugs, more richly than we reward antibiotics. So we've got the incentives wrong. So one simple idea that could work, for example, we give patents to drug companies. We understand it's a monopoly, but you get rewarded for the investments that you make to get to market. And we could play with an incentive structure where if they were able to bring meaningful antibiotics to market much quicker, something that we already offer them for doing for orphan drugs, say, we'll let you jump the queue of other drug companies that are waiting behind the big, the line, behind the red tape at the FDA. In other words, we can do something like that. That does cost society some money, right? Because you're extending a patent in a sense for a drug, or you're letting them get the money faster. But it's not as though it's money out of the exchequer today, and it would bring an incredibly valuable drug to market much faster. So there are important things we can do within the framework.
Right.
We don't have to break everything in order to solve the problem.
What do we do about legacy businesses? You were talking about energy earlier, and when you think about industries where there has not been as much innovation as you would imagine, in part, I imagine that is part of the legacy problem. Businesses that don't want to change because, frankly, it's better just to kind of eke out whatever cash we can from what we got. You actually have a quote that I've heard a couple of people use: "The black swan kills the sitting duck." I assume
I'm
that's...
delighted to hear this. It's a chapter title from Need, Speed, and Greed, available at good bookstores near you, including on campus on the other side of Pepke.
I assume that's part of the problem?
Yes, I think we're entering a much, I argue, that the nature of risk is evolving. I mean, look, there's always been risks, right? You step out of your Stone Age cave and a woolly mammoth mows you down, right? So there's always been risks in the world. But some kinds of risks that we're entering in the 21st century economy, I think, are different. And part of it has to do with our interconnectedness as a global economy. The pandemic problem, for example, is worse today than it was 30 years ago. It is more dangerous to be alive today, in part because the viral chatter that can cross across species can get to even Aspen, New York, Toronto, places like that, much quicker and soon enough to kill tens of millions of people. But also, we saw with the Icelandic volcano and the Japanese tsunami, how the global supply chain is now so integrated and so lean. But that disruption dramatically affected a number of companies trying to sell iPads, in Europe or something because of floods in Thailand or the tsunami. Right. So my point is the kinds of risks, and some risks like climate change come with irreversible triggers where you might need to act sooner. And so there is a reward, I argue, for investing in resilience. And that might not look good on the next quarterly return. So you have to make the case, if you're a company or if you're a chief executive of a city, why are we investing in resilience? Because I think you're actually investing.
It's not always innovation either.
Well, no, it depends on how you do it, right? Again, innovation doesn't come when the tank is empty. I think that's part of the point we were discussing earlier. The investments made today, and Tyler and I think, are united front on this, we need to invest in, for example, R&D for the future. Things that are the enablers of future innovation. And even during times of downturn, difficult times like now in the US and in OECD countries, you actually need to continue to invest in education, federal support for blue sky research and R&D, for example. Infrastructure. The things that will enable future innovation, even though you may need to make tougher cuts in discretionary spending, which may be justified or defense, but if you cut to the bone on the enablers of future innovation, then we're going to get less future innovation.
Right. We're going to open up to the audience. Before I do that, Tyler, give us some hope. You made me so depressed, and you do think that we are going somewhere. So what are we going to see in 10, 20 years that's cool? Give me the cool thing.
I think we've just started to reap the harvest of the internet. An area like education will be completely restructured, but that will take 20 years. I think Andrew and I agree pretty much completely on smart machines. It's also one of the least regulated sectors of our economy. They'll do wonderful things for us. Maybe I'm less worried about jobs than he is. There'll be a lot more jobs in personal services. And it may look like you're earning less, but if you have free education and very cheap health care, you'll actually be quite well off. So sometimes I say I'm a utility optimist, but a revenue pessimist. There'll be some new group of earners who may not earn a lot of money, but they'll have a lot of free stuff. And they won't be poor the way we currently think of poor. They won't be rich either. And we'll need to reimagine what it will mean to have a life like this. Yeah. That's what I think our future looks like.
Okay, let's open it up. I think we got some mics, and I know we have some hands around the room in the middle.
On the subject of grandmothers, in 1967 in Montreal, my grandmother saw what was to become the mobile phone and a phone where people could see each other. In 1967, the internet existed. Why did it take so long for these things that we had, at least beyond a conceptual stage in the mid-60s, to reach consumer potential? And are there cogs in the wheel with respect to other devices and other technologies that we have to figure out how to get out of the way to deal with things like energy, medicine, et cetera, et cetera.
The pace of large-scale innovation reminds me of Hemingway's great quote about how a man goes broke. It's gradually, then all at once. So when we look at the electrification of industry, the electrical motor was invented in the late 19th century. We only saw the productivity boost in US manufacturing starting in about 1919. So there is a large incubation period. There's a lot of elements that have to come together, and there are a lot of these kind of eureka moments where the real innovators say, wait a minute, these building blocks are in place. We have to stop putting them together in the old configurations and put them together in some radically new configurations. I think I'm with Tyler, we are in the early stages of doing that with this digital cornucopia that we had. So I'm not as surprised, looking at a little bit of economic history, I'm not as surprised that we had the internet around for decades before we got exponential with its benefits.
You have a view on that, Tyler?
Look at the music industry. It's been completely overturned by the internet. My vision of the world is everywhere will be like the music industry, but we've only seen it in a few places so far. Journalism is in the midst of that battle, and higher education is probably next.
One more,
So depressing.
manufacturing is actually in that bucket as well.
Yeah.
Because manufacturing, a lot of people kind of misinterpret what's going on. Manufacturing is a large and growing industry every year in the United States. It employs fewer people every year in the United States. That's an innovation story and a productivity story. There's great news and bad news associated with that.
Okay. Mr. Lauder, you're in the cheap seats.
In February of 2011, the European Union declared an innovation emergency. They basically found that there's not as much innovation there as they would have liked, particularly compared to America. Could you discuss international innovativeness, in particular as it relates to venture capital and other phenomena that go into that?
Let me offer a thought. Part of the reason the European Commission grew concerned is if you look back on the last 30 years, you look at the heart of Western Europe. I mean, this is arguably the richest places in the world. Southern Germany, northern Italy, Switzerland, parts of France. Ask what world-breaking or world-beating industries, what disruptive innovations have come out of that part of the world. Where are the Facebooks, the Twitters, or the equivalents, the Googles, and so on? And the answer is virtually none. If you look at the periphery of Europe, you can stretch to Cambridge, England has a successful small innovation hub. You can argue Nokia in Finland, perhaps. Skype came out of Eastern Europe. But you really look at the heart of Europe, and that's part of why they grew concerned. They said, look, we're spending enormous amounts on R&D. The dollar or euro amounts are huge. They have world-class scientists. They win as many or more Nobels than Americans do. But why is this not coming to market? Why are we not creating innovative companies? And a lot of the answer, I think, does have to come with the distinction between invention and innovation. Invention, technology, IP, patents, number of engineers graduated. Does that all sound familiar? These are the sorts of things governments tend to track when they talk about innovation. When you see rankings of most innovative economy or where companies rank, this is actually what the European government's own statistical agency, if you go back and read their reports over the last 10, 15 years, how they measure innovation in Europe. How much did we spend on R&D? How many engineers did we graduate, PhD? Number of patents, that's a big one, right? And you say, well, what have I got against that? I have nothing against that. Those are all good things. Great. More power to you. I'm an engineer from MIT by training. So I say, great, do more of that. But remember that those are inputs into a process. That's not the output. So they're measuring inputs, and they're finding out, wait a minute, we're not getting the output. And the output is the connection between fresh thinking, with or without technology, that creates value. And how do you create value? If you're a company, it can be for your customers. If you're an agency of government, it's for your citizens. If you're a new kind of hybrid enterprise, a social enterprise, you're creating value for your stakeholders. That is the much harder task. And that often involves new business models. For example, risk capital. It has a lot to do with culture. In parts of Europe, and I'll stop with this, I really think it comes down to culture, because Europe is not lacking for brains, for opportunity, for economics, for science. But parts of Europe, if you start an entrepreneurial venture and you go bust, you can't serve on the board of another company for 10 years. In Silicon Valley, you turn up, if you haven't failed twice, a good VC isn't going to put any money in you, right? They'll say, go learn on someone else's dime. When you know something, come back, right? That is the hardest change for Europe, and I don't think any amount of spending from the Commission is going to solve that.
You guys want to add on top of that?
Aging is a real problem for Europe, and to some lesser extent here, and also for Japan. So insofar as one is going to be pessimistic about future innovation, that would come from looking at demographics.
Yeah, and you know, we've studied intensively why Silicon Valley and a couple other parts of America are these hotbeds of innovation, why they're so hard to duplicate. I think that this tolerance for risk that we have is a huge part of it. The world-class universities, the risk capital, there's this really potent mix that it feels like we backed into a little bit, but we've done a pretty good job of sustaining it ever since. And I see relatively few other places in the world that are successfully mimicking all these elements and putting them together in the same way that we have.
I think you can't underestimate the role of immigrants in U.S. as well, and in terms of being willing to take risks, people who left behind their societies. I think you do find, and rates like the Kaufman studies have shown, immigrants have a higher rate of founding companies and so on.
We could do a whole panel on immigration policy. I think there are a couple actually while we're here. Chris Gates in the front.
Gentlemen, I have a smartphone, and I'm amazed when I hear some of the dumb things I hear myself saying into it. So my question really has less to do with pure technology than the innovation you see perhaps in your own lives or your own businesses in how we communicate and actually understand each other.
You mean, are we getting better at actually communicating with each
Yeah,
other?
exactly. You know, so going back to your conversation with your grandmothers in your kitchen, maybe there was an understanding that was available there, and has technology, for instance, supported the way that we actually communicate and understand better and make a difference and shift the world by understanding the positions and views of others? In other words, do you see technology supporting that?
Well, now you'd be tweeting your grandmother as opposed to standing in the kitchen.
I mean, I think we certainly have unprecedented tools for self-expression and communicating with other people. The question is that degrading the quality of our interactions and the quality of our communication, or improving them? Are these tools improving social cohesion or degrading it? It's kind of fashionable right now to talk about being alone together and how our devices separate us from other human beings. If you look back, we've been similarly pessimistic about every other communications advance, and yet somehow we keep getting together in rooms like this and talking to each other. So I'm kind of blasé about the alone together scenario.
Yes, sir. Yep.
Is there hope in all of the technology that you're seeing and change that you're seeing for the competitiveness, the global competitiveness of the bottom half of the United States, and what would drive that?
Andrew.
Short answer is no. When I look at what technology is doing and the capabilities it's demonstrating, I get very nervous about the fate of the, as you say, the bottom half of the workforce, the less educated, less skilled, in some ways maybe less raw IQ portions of the workforce. My biggest worry going forward, as I said, is I think they're going to have less to offer the labor force. And I'm with Tyler. Every previous time someone has fretted about technological unemployment, they've been proved dead flat wrong by events. So if you want to learn a bit more about why I think this time is different, tomorrow, this is my chance for a plug. Tomorrow at 10:30, I'm going to give a talk about the book and why I think this time actually is different. My mantra is I would really not want to be a median skilled knowledge worker in the economy that we're heading into.
Okay, different question. What's the answer then? Beyond education, which I assume is the standard answer.
I am not worried about having a society that generates sufficient wealth to take care of all of its people. I'm worried about how to distribute that wealth, but more deeply, we came across a great quote from Voltaire when we were writing our book. He got it exactly right. He said, "Work saves us from three great evils: boredom, vice, and need." The need is going to be the easiest of the three to take care of. I wonder what a fulfilling life is going to look like for people when work is a much smaller chunk of what they're going to do for their lives.
What percentage of America do you think is going to be experiencing this smaller chunk?
Well, we have an employment to population ratio of about 58% right now. That's the percent of working age people who have work. Hasn't been that low since the early 80s when women had not entered the workforce yet. That number has not budged from the depths of the Great Recession. And when I do my back of the envelope calculations, my kind of optimistic projections don't see that number changing a heck of a lot.
Right.
I see it going down a lot, maybe to 45%. And I think in the longer run, not soon, but we'll consider Milton Friedman's idea of a guaranteed annual income. And you'll have many people not maybe being very productive. They'll move to much cheaper areas They will have some basic level of support. We'll live in a country where, say, 10, 15% of people are like millionaires, and it will be a very different place.
So
That
that's the future. I don't know if we're going to call that innovation, but that's what the future looks like.
That's my highly cautious prediction.
Yeah.
What about technology and education?
I had a chance to listen, so the questions about technology and education, I had a chance to listen to Peter Norvig talk a while back, who's one of the top artificial intelligence researchers. He hangs out between Google and Stanford. He's one of the pioneers of offering what they're calling MOOCs, or massive open online courses. This is not just the old school of online education where you put the video of the lecture up online. This is rethinking how you take a top flight course, a Stanford level artificial intelligence course, you break it up into tiny chunks so that people don't get bored watching 45 minutes worth of video. You stream those out, you intersperse those with exercises. They've taught these MOOCs around the world to, in some cases, upwards of 100,000 people sign up to take the course. The last course that I heard of, 23,000 people sat for the final exam. And I was looking around to try to back up this factoid, and I couldn't do it, so this could be an urban myth. But I have heard that the top Stanford student, there were 175 Stanford kids, this is a tough bar. These are smart people taking the course. The top Stanford student scored about number 400 on that final exam. So around the world, there are about 400 people who could master the material and do better on that. I get incredibly optimistic when I think about education heading in that direction. Professor Summers talked about how hard it is to get productivity in education because that typically just means more kids in each classroom. A great way to scale up education is to digitize it and experiment like what they're doing.
Good question. Oh, go ahead.
This is the problem, I think, in a lot of areas. The real constraint is behavioral. In less than 5 years, we'll have an incredible free education online. Arguably, we have it now. But how many people out there will actually care? I'd say we don't know yet, but I worry what the answer will be.
Can I jump on that? Because I think that's a really important point. Because I think it's exactly right. And until those kinds of alternative educations are valued, especially by employers, then we're not making real progress. But I start to hear stories, especially about people trying to hire technical talent, who are looking a lot less at the classic signals, where you went to school, what your GPA was, and are looking a lot more at things like your top coder score, which is your score in online programming competitions, your GitHub score, which is a social site for coders, and maybe the grade you got in this MOOC, because they will give you a certificate saying that you completed the course. You know, please let's see more of that.
Right. We had a question in the middle there. Yep.
Hello, my name is Raimi Banks, and I work in the technology industry in Silicon Valley for security technology. Earlier you said that innovation doesn't come when the tank is empty. So some might argue, well, the economy is looking sort of empty right now. How do you think that that might affect innovation for the near future or the far future? And then alternatively, you know, even in Silicon Valley, we have to do a lot less, or we have to do a lot more with a lot less. So do you think kind of the opposite of that statement would be more people can be innovative when they have less to work with?
Well, in a sense, you answered your own question very beautifully. I think that even though the economic times are difficult, investment has continued. Companies are investing in the enablers of private corporate investment continues, and the scientific investment I'd mentioned before continues as it has for the last decade or two. But the bigger point, though, coming out of your comment, is if you look back at times of great desperation, the Great Recession, for example, an economist, Alexander Field, has written a wonderful book about how that was the most productive decade of the 20th century, contrary to expectations and previous economic thought. And lots of new business models, as well as new technologies, are forged in that kind of desperation. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention. We all know this. And time again, we see this. So I think, though it's painful to go through periods like this, as long as we don't cut the enablers of future innovation to the bone, that's part of why I think we've had this conversation, I think you can actually expect a robust rebound.
The physicist, was his first name James Rutherford? Do I have that right? He had a great quote. He said, "Gentlemen, we're out of money. It's time to start thinking."
Excellent.
And to your point, I think one other thing that's really helping us out a lot here is just the relentlessness of Moore's law. So the computing resources that were inconceivably expensive a generation ago are now literally free. So data scientist is a new job description, this red hot job description. They're distributed all around the world, and they work basically on supercomputers, which they almost all rent at very low prices from Amazon. They all have an EC2 account. They put a piece of free software on top. Sometimes they use R, which is this really robust statistical software on top of that, and a college student can become a world-class data scientist using these cheap and free resources. I'm blown away by that.
Let's take two more. Well, actually, we have time probably for 2 or 3 more questions, but go ahead, sir.
Eric Topol at Scripps. I've enjoyed this discussion. I wanted to get back to healthcare innovation for just a second, because here there's no shortage of innovation. In fact, Andrew touched on it with respect to being able to diagnose a skin lesion, but you can diagnose ear infections in kids and eye refraction through ads and apps, and the list goes on and on. Sleep disorders without going to a hospital sleep lab. But the block here is not the regulatory aspect, it's the medical community. And so what I want to ask is, we've learned, for example, in HIV, we would never have made the tremendous advances in HIV without consumer activism. So could technology today, like what we saw with social networking and what we saw with the Arab Spring, Occupy, could that be harnessed to fuel consumer activism at a large scale to drive the medical innovations forward that we need?
I mean, I think it absolutely could. I look at what happened with the movement to make sure that SOPA and PIPA legislation didn't get passed in Congress, because that stuff was headed for just routine approval through Congress, basically. And it was only when these flash mobs formed online and lots of different voices said, this is a terrible idea, that we actually derailed that legislation. I found it was a really amazing moment. You bring up the Arab Spring, we see this over and over. So I wouldn't be surprised if the dysfunctions of our healthcare system started to cause people to come together using technology to advocate for more, better, different, cheaper.
I think we had a question in the middle. There, yes, ma'am.
Hi, Gay Beth Abrams from Los Angeles. The entertainment industry and the advertising industry have been challenged by quickly changing technology, and they're adapting. And I wondered, do you have any vision of what is going to happen to those two large industries?
My sense is, if you take Hollywood, it's already the case. Movies are based on previously existing intellectual property. They're low-risk ventures. They're global. They're not really that innovative. And then you have a lot going on at the YouTube level. Super low capital costs. No one agrees what's good, but people have a lot of fun with it. And I think we'll see this continuing split. The super high capital cost, globalized date-night product, which is often kind of not that intelligent. And then YouTube, which will range from obscene to terrible to awful to sometimes brilliant and occasionally amusing. And we're almost already there. I just think we'll see more of it.
And I think by a lot of the conventional measures, the industries are going to shrink. Tyler brings up the fact that the music industry is a lot smaller than it used to be, measured in revenue tunes. How many of us are listening to a lot of music these days? How many of us have a music library on our phones right now? We're listening to a ton more music. I think the YouTube example is a great one. There's a massive amount of content out there, huge amounts of it trash, some of it by any definition really fantastic. I think his notion of the split is a really smart notion. The industry is shrinking. And I don't know if it's hit steady state yet. My guess is that in revenue terms, it might well continue to shrink.
We have a question in the corner here, sir.
This is for you. When you were researching Too Big to Fail, is that a negative consequence of innovation?
Is that a negative consequence of innovation? At some level, yes. At some level, I think what happened on Wall Street was a negative consequence of innovation. But then it goes to this larger issue and question about what you want the regulatory environment to ultimately look like. And Larry Summers, for those of you who were here for the previous session, we're talking about how hard it is to start a new bank. I know some very interesting people in Silicon Valley who would love to try to innovate the world of finance actually for us as consumers, and actually are scared to get into that business because it's so difficult. And so there are some serious roadblocks, but at the same time, there's the flip side of me says I don't want to ever have to have another financial crisis. And then there's sort of the question is always about risk tolerance, right? What are we? What is politically, culturally palatable to us in terms of what risks we think are worth taking. But,
I heard
thank
someone
you for
bring
the
up a
question.
great analogy. Do we want the world's most innovative bridges in our country? We might want the world's most stable bridges in our country. I'm not sure I want the world's most innovative financial system, given what we learned over the past 5 years. So, let's be sure we're innovating in the right industries in the right areas.
Right. Okay, we have time, because these guys got to get across the campus quite soon, so let's take 2 more questions. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Erica Jacobs. I also work in Silicon Valley in security software. When will we innovate in our political system? Because truly, many of the things we've talked about today are stunted by that system. I mean, we talked about energy, et cetera. We all know what what happened during the Bush years. Still, how difficult that is. Anyone care to?
I'm going to outsource this question. Jen Palka, who founded Code for America, is giving a talk here at 5 o'clock tonight. I'd really encourage everybody to go to it. She does a fantastic job. Her organization is all about innovation in government without having to confront the crazy polarization and the dysfunctions of bureaucracy. She gives me some hope that we can chip away at some of the logjam that we experience in dealing with the government.
I think we had 2 more questions in the middle. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Raj Kamdar, and I work for the New York City Department of Education. Everyone's talking about how technology and education clearly represent the most streamlined conduit for exchanging content, knowledge, and skills, like what's going on at Stanford and learning to code online, right? So what innovation on the ground in high schools and middle schools and elementary schools, where we're starting to experiment with technology in the classroom, and our biggest concern is how is innovation going to foster social emotional skills and interpersonal skills? It's kind of what Chris had alighted upon earlier. Is technology helping kids and young people communicate better?
I'm an optimist about things like Facebook and Twitter. I think they're pretty good. They can be misused, they can lead to problems, but all the fake studies you hear about leading to all the divorces or child kidnappings is mostly false. And they seem to foster ties of community. So it's a good thing. It's another way in which the world can gain in happiness and maybe even lose in GDP.
In addition to which, I'm not sure which halcyon period we were comparing the teenagers of today to. Like the incredibly well-adjusted social, love talking to their parents ones of the 1970s?
Right. No, just a quick word on this. I don't think human nature has changed, right? And the tools at our disposal has changed a bit. But if we look at, does technology reinforce weak links, right? This is the current sort of Malcolm Gladwell thesis that's been kicked around a lot. And in the Arab Spring, was it because of Facebook and Twitter? And of course, it wasn't because of Facebook and Twitter. People had to have real connections first. And then you find weak links become strong links. But the human connection is the most important thing. And so technology will never substitute for that, the reason why we're all in this room. But I think it can act as a force multiplier. And that's a good thing.
You asked about emotional intelligence. I hear really amazing and encouraging stories about kids on the Asperger's to autism spectrum learning to interact with technology, learning with things like tablets, and those being huge helps in developing these kids into kind of more emotionally mainstream people, which is a great benefit for their lives.
Okay, final question goes to you, ma'am. Yes.
How much has bigger government actually reduced the ability to innovate? And so many people today, particularly you see it in Europe, in France in particular, where government spending is over 50% of GDP, the lack of innovation. Then how do you break that? How do you break people from wanting those entitlements and going out more on their own?
A small question.
This is a great question for a George Mason economist, I think.
Well, the French just announced they were lowering their retirement age for 128 civil service workers. They recently buried the Minitel last week, and they're planning on raising taxes on the wealthy. So I surrender that battle. It's been lost, to my regret, but I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you. I sympathize.
On that very promising note, thank you. Thank you to the panel, Vijay, Andrew, Tyler. Thank you for your questions. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.